Hello, my name is Rich Howard, owner of Architectural Builder Supply. This video is to demonstrate and then discuss a little bit of the science behind shimming open a pin tumbler cylinder. In order to shim open a cylinder, well, you need a cylinder, obviously, that you don't have a key for. And it's the object of what you need to get open. To do that, you need two things, sometimes three. You're going to certainly need a blank. It needs to be actually blank. If you were to use a key that is cut, which you can do, it does work, it would really depend on what that first cut is, but you would generally want a blank key, and it would be best if it wasn't one-bitted or O-bitted or cut at all, because really when you're shimming a cylinder you're just using the very tip of the key, but a blank would be the tool of choice, so to speak. The second thing you're going to need, you'll always need this, you'll need some shim stock, a piece of curved shim. This is something that is very typically seen in any locksmith shop, and it will be a tool that is absolutely mandatory to have. It's a very thin piece of curved metal, and its intent is to slide between the bottom pin and the driver or top pin to create a shear line. The third thing that you may or may not need, depending on the cylinder, is a vise. This cylinder I know I'll need a vise for because I happen to know a little bit about this cylinder, which I'll describe earlier. But cylinders that are really easy to shim open, you'll end up being able to do it with just two hands or maybe in your lap, so to speak. So let's demonstrate how to shim this cylinder open. If you are enjoying this video, please click thumbs up or like, and also please consider subscribing to our channel. Let's move on to the rest of the video. So the principle of shimming open a cylinder is where you are attempting to push the shim between the bottom pin, which resides in the plug, and the driver pin, which generally resides up in the top of the cylinder, or what's called the Bible. When you have the proper key inserted, the bottom pin and the driver pin are at the shear line, meaning the line that is between the plug and the core, the cylinder plug, and the cylinder housing. When the pins have been elevated to the proper height, they are then stacked up evenly with the shear line, and the key will then rotate. All you're doing with the shim stock is attempting to squeeze it between the driver or top pin and the bottom pin. The blank key, as I had said earlier, the only part of this that you're really using is just the angled tip of the key itself. You don't need anything back here. It's useless. It's really just a tool handle at this point. Because what you're doing is the angled tip of the key, as you push it in, if my finger is the bottom pin, as you push it in, it forces the pin up. It forces the pin to go up and down. It is in that space of it elevating that you are then trying to stick the shim into. Now, I know that this cylinder is not the typical cylinder in the sense that it will likely not be super fast for me to get this open, and I'll explain why. I'm using a vise only because I'm able to, I suppose, it's easier to shim with a vise is the bottom line, and I'm able to better demonstrate. When you put this in the vise, not much tension, you'll crush the cylinder very easily, or you'll compress the components together to where the plug doesn't rotate, so just enough to keep it from moving on you, which doesn't take much pressure at all. The key, what I like to do is exercise the key. This is actually kind of stiff. I can tell immediately that this is going to be a little harder to get in because the parts are a little bit stiffer, which means it's harder to push the shim in because this is so incredibly thin. By the time you have it halfway in the cylinder, it has the springs in the Bible and the driver pins pushing down on it. So when you have one of the, like the fifth chamber pushing down on the shim, it's not so difficult. When you've got two, you can tell there's more resistance. By the time you get to 4 or 5, it's harder to push that shim in. So I'm going to insert the shim in the back of the cylinder, right where the shear line needs to be, which is right here between the plug and the top of the Bible. That's where the shear line is going to occur. I don't want the shim to go in over here or over here. It needs to get right there. Exactly straight all the way down. That's where that needs to go in. Pretending that that's straight all the way down. So I'll put it back in the vise. Bring up the light here a little bit. So two things have to happen simultaneously. You exercise the key in and out, not greatly, because again, all it is the tip of the key that's important. At the same time, you're pushing the shim in and putting a little bit of pressure on the shim, moving in the direction of the cylinder, so that when the two pins are lined up, the little shim can sneak in between where the driver and the bottom pins are. So exercising the key, at the same time I'm putting pressure, or I'm feeding the shim into the cylinder plug. And I feel like I've gotten to the fifth, what would be actually the first chamber on this, and now it's not going any further. There should be no reason why I can't push that any further, except when I encounter this, I start to think that I have a spool pin. And I did. So I had a spool pin in there, I believe. And the reason is the shim, by the way, it's open. The shim is, you're pushing the shim in, and it won't go any further. You can tell when you pull the key out that there's only one pin that's moving a little. It's not moving healthily, fully, because you can tell it's you're hitting a dead end. So you can tell that you've got the pin moved to where it can't move. That's a result of the driver pin being locked in place. A spool pin is going to, well, it's going to look like a spool of thread. If you imagine a spool of thread with all the thread taken off, the top and bottom of the spool have a greater diameter than the inside component. The shim has hit the inside component and can't go any further. So what I did was I backed the shim out a little bit. Then I could tell that my behavior of exercising the key changed. My key moved a little bit more. And then I tried it again by trying to feed in the shim while exercising the key, and at the same time putting a very slight amount of rotational force clockwise, because as soon as you create shear with that rotational force, you will then be able to open the cylinder just like I did here. Okay. Now let's switch back to the other screen view, and we'll take a closer look at the parts here to prove what I suspected was in here.
If you've not hit subscribe yet, we would very much appreciate if you did, and hopefully you're enjoying this video. Now let's get back to it.
So let's discuss what happened here, and here's a closer up view of the shimmed open cylinder. I have it rotated partially. You'll notice that the shim stays in position when the plug rotates, and that's certainly where you want it to be, there's no doubt. However, at this point, it's absolutely safe generally to pull the shim out. Pulling the shim out is something that you want to do after you've inspected what the plug is, because the plug may have a feature to it that's not perfectly cylindrical. I've inspected this plug, and it would be best if we were at about 30-degree rotation before pulling the shim out. The purpose of pulling the shim out, of course, the purpose of shimming the cylinder open in the first place, is to get the plug out. So I'm going to demonstrate or talk more about this, the blank being a tool, in a moment. But at this point, I want to move on to illustrating the theory that there was a spool pin, or at least one spool pin in here. So I'm going to pull the shim out, and then I'm going to get the plug follower, and I'm going to pull that plug out. So let's do that now. So we're going to pull that shim out. Let's do that right now. So you want to make sure that the plug doesn't rotate. It won't, though. Just, you can pull that out. It's just going to come right out. Let's take a look at the shim. So here's the shim. It's a very thin piece of, extremely thin piece of material, curved metal. Ferrous based. Well, you know what? It might be stainless, and I say that only because stainless would exhibit magnetic properties once it's worked. So I don't know what this is actually made of. Okay, the thickness of this shim, just for the sake of you knowing what it is, my caliper is telling me that it's 0.015. Extremely thin. The margin between the plug and the cylinder housing will tolerate something so thin being put in. What you'll notice is on this shim that I've used, I have a little tiny kink in it. Really little artifact left over from the process of hitting that. Not only hitting the, there we go, not only hitting the side of the pins, of the bottom or top pins, but also dead ending into that spool pin. You can see it right there. Now, this shim that I was using has, the other end of it, has an even bigger artifact. So someone was obviously using the shim. You'll get to the point where those artifacts impair your ability to smoothly push the shim in, because now the shim's not 0.015, it's now much thicker because of the kinked artifact. Here's what you do. You can see where this is heading. Take an extremely short amount off of that. I have what's left over, and you have a clean, pristine end. Take that and just slice it down. A 1/16 of an inch is probably all you would actually need. Okay, now I've got a plug follower here. I'm going to just carefully push that in and get my plug out without rotating the plug. You do not want to rotate the plug unintentionally because you can seize the cylinder. So I've got my bottom pins here. They're in there. I put my blank into there, and all I'm going to do is elevate these pins. Now, what you absolutely do not want to do is lose any of these pins. You don't know anything about the pins. You don't know their length. You don't know if these are master pins sitting on top of bottom pins, but to lose these renders the condition of the cylinder as unknown. Customers coming to you and saying that I've lost my key. If you're like me, you're not good at picking open a cylinder. Tension rod and common locksmithing pick. I'll shim one open every single time that I can, and the only time that I won't, because I've been able to get every single one of them open that I've encountered, the only time I won't is if I don't have a blank. And I don't know if I've ever successfully shimmed with a lock pick. That in theory should work very well. But if I don't have the blank, I can't try it. But there are times when I have a cut key, and I've done it with a cut key as well, because all that I really need as a tool is that leading edge of my blank. The issue, though, as I had said earlier, is that you need it to be blank because that first cut may cause a major problem. You can see that I've lost a tremendous amount of height of my leading edge because of the first cut on this key. My blank goes all the way up to here. My cut key stops at the height of the first cut, which happens to be, if this is correct, a 6. So a 6 cut eliminates a third of my potential height for lifting the pin. If it's a 1 cut, you're probably okay. But I've been able to successfully do it with that. But not, you may not, because you might have a too deep cut in the first position, or pardon me, in chamber 5 in this case. This would be chamber 5, to be able to allow you enough elevation of the bottom pin because of the reduced overall height of that leading edge. So I had discussed earlier the idea of there being a spool pin, and I'm going to remove the driver pin in here and see if it is indeed a spool pin. And I can see that it is. I'm going to lock it in place there. You really won't be able to see that. I've got the tweezer, I've got the spool pin held in the tweezers, and now you can see exactly why it's called a spool pin, because it looks like a spool of thread. So what's happening is, as you're feeding the shim in, it's not sneaking underneath, it's getting trapped inside of here. So ideally, the pin will sneak underneath. But in this case, it was getting trapped, but only in the first chamber. Only here. I got through all the other 4 very quickly. Now, it could be luck, it could be skill, it could be that there are no other spool pins. The second chamber, it has a spool pin. No doubt, I can see that. The third chamber, it has a spool pin. Okay, and I lost one. I lost 2. Yeah, definitely. So, chambers 1, 2, and 3 had spool pins. I'm going to quickly put them back because I need the tweezers for this, and then I will return the tool. This is what someone here in the company calls bombing the cylinder, when you unintentionally explode or drop all the driver pins out when you don't want to. Anyway, to take the top or driver pins out to inspect them, that's what you would do. So I've got them put back in place. Thank you, sweetheart. And yeah, theories confirmed. There were spool pins. Okay. Makes sense that it was harder in the first chamber, or the furthest in, because I had the combined pressure of 4 springs pushing down on my shim, and you can tell it's harder to move the shim in and out when you have those 4 springs pushing down on the shim. So what we'll do at this point is we will switch to a different camera view, and we're going to take a look at more of exactly what's happening inside the cylinder. You know what's worse than not knowing where to put the neutral leg on a 3-phase high voltage panel? It's not participating in the Architectural Builder Supply March giveaway. Okay, let's get into some of the science of what's happening here. So I'm going to remove the first bottom pin from the cylinder. I'm going to put the cylinder away from me so I don't accidentally knock it down. I'm going to then pull out of my plug the 5th chamber. We're working on the 5th chamber because it's the first chamber that your shim is going to encounter. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So you'll notice likely right away that that is not a spool pin. That's what it all looks like inside of the cylinder. Well, the cylinder plug and the housing. That's what everything there looks like. So you've got a compressed spring. Yeah, just trying to get the camera to focus a little bit better. You've got a compressed spring, the driver pin, which is just a standard driver pin, then you've got the bottom pin. The point being is when you get your shim pushed in, you now have the combined, this is the rear of the plug. Take note that there's a notch here that may tell you that it's the rear of the plug, which in this case I know that it is. So that's important to note, so that when you're putting your plug back into the housing, which end is the front and which is the back. They've put a little notch here. What's nice about that is you can actually feel it without having to look at it. That might speed up your process. So all of that is right inside of the plug in that first chamber. And as you are taking your key and you're pushing it in, as you're exercising the key in and out, you can see that if I pushed that, because it's constrained in the chamber, it's going to force the pin to be elevated. If I push that any further, that bottom pin is going to get pushed up. You get the concept. As you're pushing the key in and out, the entire stack is moving up and down. It's into this shear line between the driver pin and the bottom pin where you want to successfully insert your shim. That's what you're going for. The simultaneous movement of the key back and forth, just very slightly. Doing it only in this like 3/16 amount of room at a time is all that's going to take to elevate that. As you're trying to gingerly feed the shim in, looking for the seam. This is probing for the seam between the driver and the bottom pin. As you successfully find those, you'll then be able to go on to the next chamber, and the next chamber, and the fourth chamber, and then finally the fifth chamber is what that's going to be. And that's what you're going for. Okay. Now, that's the science of what's happening inside the cylinder. Let's switch back to the screen view and do a summary on this. If you are enjoying this video, please click thumbs up or like, and also please consider subscribing to our channel. Let's move on to the rest of the video. So, again, you need shim stock. You should have more than one. You should have, I believe you'll get them in a package of 25 or perhaps 100. For us, generally here, it depends on who's doing the shimming work, but a pack of 25 shims can last years. Or a pack of 25 shims may not be enough. If you are fighting your shim in, if you're using an amount of pressure that is far more than that's necessary, or you're dealing with something that is spool pins, very dirty. If you have a cylinder that's very, very dirty, I would recommend cleaning it first. A proper approach to cylinder servicing is to not only repin it, but to clean it and to use the manufacturer's original lubricant. Whatever the manufacturer uses, whatever they recommend is what you would use. You can use WD-40 initially to get the key moving in and out, to break up all the years of gunk. But after you get the cylinder open, you'll replace the pins. You should replace everything, the drivers, the bottom pins, the springs, masters if it's a master pin cylinder, and about master keyed cylinders. That only makes it easier to shim them open because you now have more than one opportunity to sneak your shim in. The issue when a customer comes in and says, I lost my keys for this cylinder, I need a customer walks in, I need a key for this. Okay, hands you a cylinder, and you say to yourself, you might take your wand and go abracadabra. If you're like me, you don't just snap your fingers and a key materializes. There are people in the world that can very, very easily get cylinders open, quite easily. I'm not one of those people, so it's not just abracadabra. As I put together this Schlage cylinder, at least I think I am. Yes, I am. So that cylinder's put back together. The key was always here. I didn't know necessarily what it was. You might ask more information about that, and in fact, you're obligated to, in my opinion and the opinion of the industry. You're going to want to ask the client, hey, is this master keyed? That'd be a great question. Before you even get to that question, you're probably going to want to ask the client, who are you? What if somebody gets a cylinder off their door? What if someone gets a cylinder off of someone else's door and comes into you and says, I need a key? You then disassemble it, shim it, pick it, create a key for it, originate a key for it. He goes back, reinstalls it, and now he has an unauthorized key that works that. So creating a key for a cylinder is not something that you do lightly, and is certainly not something that you should do without understanding the risk of involving yourself in the creation or origination of a key for a cylinder. When we create keys for cylinders, meaning we need to get the cylinder opened by means of shimming or picking, it's because we know the ownership of the lock. It's very likely just a scenario that we've lost the key that operates it. We no longer know what it is. And in order to continue the job, you need to get the cylinder open. You don't care what the pins are, you toss those because you're rekeying it to something else anyway. So be quite mindful when you're opening a cylinder. For who? What's the purpose? What is the reason that you have to do it? Now back to the shims. this, when you look at a shim like this, it's very easy to tell how this was being used. This was the part obviously going into the cylinder, because that's where it's kinked. And the part over here is more V-shaped, because what will end up happening is, in order to feed that in, you'll take your forefinger and your thumb and pinch it to create a V, so it gives it more rigidity, so you can push harder in there. And that's what that looks like. And then you'll usually have a bent artifact at the very tip of the shim as well. The bottom line is, this is likely unusable, because once this gets kinked or bent, it does get kinked and bent right back again. You can try to salvage it a little bit. I generally don't throw these out. I'll throw them out when I have a lot of them, but I'll keep them, because you never know when you get to a job and you now have to shim a cylinder open that you didn't plan for and you don't have any shims. So I'll hang on to these. Don't forget the trick about taking your scissors and just slicing off a very small amount on the end. And that's about all I believe there might be to say about shimming open a cylinder. If you have any questions on this or any other locksmithing approach, please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you. You know what's worse than losing your Z-axis on your CNC machine? It's not participating in the Architectural Builders Supply March giveaway.
Thank you for watching, and if you've enjoyed this video, please click thumbs up, please subscribe, and maybe even send the video to someone that you know. Thank you.